Plato's Meno, one of his epistemological masterpieces alongside the Theaetetus, that is to say, one of his masterpieces in the study of knowledge. There are four characters. Socrates is one. Another is Anytus. He is an Athenian gentleman who later is one of those who brings Socrates to court, an incident described in the Apology. And then we have Meno, a visitor from Thessaly. And finally, one of his slaves, an unnamed character, but a character with an important speaking role in the second half of the dialogue. Meno asks the first question: can virtue be taught? Or if it cannot, how is it that virtue does come to us? How do we get virtue? Socrates answers in a typical fashion. He says that he does not know what virtue is. He confesses his ignorance, and then he asks a question: what is virtue? Meno thinks he knows what virtue is and proceeds to give some examples of virtue: the virtue of a man, the virtue of a woman, the virtue of a child, and so on. Socrates responds in a typical fashion, pointing out that Meno has not actually defined virtue, but has just given examples of it. And again, challenging Meno to explain what virtue is. Meno still thinks he knows what virtue is, and so he tries some definitions of virtue which Socrates refutes. Then Meno finally realizes he has no idea what virtue is. Then he gives Socrates a challenge. Socrates wants him to keep pursuing knowledge with him. Meno is reluctant, and he gives Socrates a skeptical challenge, a challenge to the possibility of gaining knowledge. Here is a formal version of the challenge. Either I have knowledge of something or I do not. If I do have knowledge of it, then I do not need to seek knowledge of it and cannot seek knowledge of it because I can only seek for something I do not actually have. But if I do not have knowledge of it, then I cannot seek it because I don't know what it is I'm looking for. And I wouldn't know where to look for it or how to recognize it if I came across it. So either way, learning is impossible because seeking knowledge of a thing is impossible. And therefore, knowledge is not possible. Meno gives us this skeptical challenge, and the only part of it Socrates rejects is the very last part, that knowledge is not possible. He implicitly allows the conclusion that learning is not possible to stand. But he gives Meno a theory according to which knowledge is still possible. It is the theory of recollection. Socrates says that he has heard divine things from priests and priestesses and poets, namely what we call transmigration of souls or reincarnation. Socrates suggests that the soul is immortal and has lived many times before in previous lives, and that in its infinite past the soul has picked up knowledge of everything, and that knowledge remains in the soul. It remains in the soul even now. It has only to be awoken. It has only to be rediscovered. It has only to be recollected. And what we call learning in this life is simply this recollection. Socrates illustrates his theory and tries to give evidence for it by interrogating Meno's slave. This boy has never studied geometry. Socrates asks him an interesting geometrical question. And this poor guy thinks he knows the answer and proceeds to give it. But then Socrates shows him that he gave the wrong answer. He tries again, and Socrates shows him that it was the wrong answer. And then he admits that he has no idea what the right answer is. Socrates points out that this is good. Previously he was ignorant, but thought he had knowledge. Now he knows he has not knowledge. Then Socrates proceeds to ask him some more questions, with the result that he comes to understand what the answer actually is. And yet without Socrates ever actually telling him the answer. Now this slave has never studied geometry. Socrates has not told him the answer, and yet he has given the answer, with no help from Socrates except the asking of the right questions, questions that prompted his mind to recollect that geometrical knowledge. And so where has that knowledge come from? It was always in the slave's mind. Thus, says Socrates. So he and Meno continue to pursue knowledge. They continue to investigate virtue and whether it can be taught. And for a while, they entertain the theory that virtue is a form of knowledge. But then Socrates has a short conversation with Anytus, in which he suggests that if virtue is knowledge, virtuous men will teach it to their sons. And however, we have various examples of Athenian men who were virtuous but whose sons were not virtuous. It follows that virtue is not knowledge. This makes Anytus upset, and he storms off. In the meantime, the conversation with Meno continues, and they conclude as follows. Virtue is not knowledge. Knowledge is not the same thing as true belief. This is one of the fundamental insights in epistemology, the study of knowledge, that all knowledge is true belief, but not vice versa. Knowledge is true belief plus something else. Something that ties down the belief to the truth, so that what we believe will be true, not only at the moment by luck, but in the future as a result of the tying down. The thing that ties belief down to the truth has something to do with reason and recollection. Or you might say it has something to do with evidence. And knowledge and virtue are not the same thing, but virtue is a true belief of sorts. Socrates, at the very end of the dialogue, suggests that virtue as we know it is true belief. And he finally answers this question, can virtue be taught? No, it cannot be taught. And how does it come to us? He says it comes to us as a gift of the gods. But he hints at the possibility of a virtue which is knowledge, a virtue which is true belief about what is good, but which also has that third thing connecting truth to belief, connecting belief to truth, tying belief down to the truth. And this virtue which is knowledge, he suggests, is not the privilege of man, it is the possession of gods alone.